Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Mountain View. The photograph on the right was a reference and inspiration for my painting. I really didn't do much to change the composition, and I decided to paint it with local color, so the trees are green and the sky is blue. And one of the things about this reference photo is it's very easy to spot the major shapes. The composition is primarily made up of large shapes such as the trees, the mountain, and the sky. In this very simple sketch, I've drawn the major shapes and I'm indicating where the large trees are with a vertical line. I'm not trying to outline each individual fir tree with my sketch. The sketch is done with a B pencil on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper. The colors used in this painting are cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, royal blue, sap green, pyrrole red, rose madder quinacridone, raw sienna, and raw umber. I'm going to begin my painting by putting in a sky wash using a mixture of cerulean blue and water. So I've mixed a generous amount on my palette. It's just a middle value, light middle value cerulean blue, and I'm using a 1-inch flat brush to randomly put this wash down. I'm leaving some areas without paint because I want to create the feeling that there's some little puffy clouds floating in the sky, and I'm going to soften those edges with a fine mist spray bottle. I'm working at about a 15-degree angle, so the paint is going to flow downward. However, because I'm working wet on dry, it's only going to go where I've wet the paper. Even though I'm using a spray bottle, I was careful on where I place that. But I can leave the edge of this wash down along the large mountain shape, and I'm not concerned with it really running down the page because the dry paper will resist the flow of the paint. I just need to make sure that I don't get too big a bead of water there that it will break loose and come down the page. So I just touch it with a damp brush and pick that up. Once again, my brush is fully saturated, so I'm loading it as I leave my palette with as much moisture as it can hold. And I'm putting this very wet mixture down on the paper here, and I'm letting it just kind of flow, and I'm influencing that with the spray that I'm putting down there, so it's giving some areas where it's lighter and other areas where it's a little darker and bluer, just to kind of create that light cloud in a blue, otherwise blue sky. I've completely dried the sky wash, and now I'm going to come in and use some liquid masking, and I want to mask out a few of the areas of snowpack on the mountain. So there's some areas that are very white, and I want to protect that area of the paper, and I could paint around these. However, this is an easy way for me to mask that area, save the white, and let me be a little freer as I put down some of the washes that I'll be putting down. And I'm also going to do some more masking here, which you'll see as soon as I'm done masking these kind of snowpack shapes that are on the side of the mountain. So I'm using a liquid masking fluid that's being dispensed in a plastic bottle with a metal point, which gives a fine line. And I could be using a little thicker bead here if I wanted, but this will do the job. Now here I'm going to get the last of these shapes. So this will allow me to put down a large wash over top of this and not have to worry about trying to paint around these to save the white of the paper. Next I'm going to take a toothbrush and some liquid mask from a jar, and I've rinsed the toothbrush in some soapy water before I'm doing this to help with cleanup. But I'm going to use this just to create a little bit of splatter in the area that will be the trees. I like to have the little sparkle coming through the trees. When you look at them, they're fairly solid shapes, but they have just little hints of light coming through, And this is a good way to create that texture that kind of appears in the tree, that little sparkle and a little bit of light that peeks through some of these very thick branches. So I just splatter it, and I also put a little bit on the mountain just to give a little texture to that. Now I'm going to apply that mask using a fine point to this single tree shape, which is in the composition. It's just a dried trunk of a tree that's lost most of its branches, and it's just kind of a light gray tone. So I'm just going to mask that out. So again, it's very easy for me just to paint washes over top of that. I don't have to worry so much about losing the whites and trying to paint around the edge of this large linear shape. In addition to the trunk, there's just some small broken branches that come off the side of this linear shape. So I'm going to take this fine tip and just dispense the masking fluid to mask those areas that will represent the branches, the broken branches that are coming off the edge of the trunk. Now my masking fluid is completely dry and the paper is completely dry. I'm going to begin painting this large shape that represents the kind of mountain range here that's in the distance. And I'm using a mixture of cerulean blue with raw umber, and I'm also going to mix in some raw sienna to have a combination of a warm and cool mixture. So that raw umber and cerulean blue, it's going to be on the cool side, and then when I introduce some raw sienna into that, it'll warm it up a little bit. So I have that variation in this shape that I'm painting. So I'm applying this with a wash brush. This is a round, jumbo round small it's called. And my brush is a saturated brush once again. So I'm fully loaded it with a mixture from my palette, and it has a lot of water in it. My objective at this point is to put this base wash on that gives this variety of kind of warm and cool earth colors on this shape that represents the top of the mountain here. And then once it's dry, I'll come back in with some much cooler tones and paint some of the shadowed areas and give an indication of some of the features of this mountainous area. As you come down the face of this rocky mountainous area, you start to encounter a series of fern trees that are lower down on the mountain face. So I'm going to start to give an indication of those. The wash that I put on the mountain shape is still wet. So right now I'm working wet and wet, and I've got a mixture of sap green with some pyrrole red in it. And I'll also use a mixture of sap green with some pyrrole red and royal blue. So some of these green tones I'm using will lean towards the warm side, while other ones will be more cool, especially in some of these shadowed areas. And then some of the trees that are a little distant and back in a pocket or shadowed area tend to take on a cooler bluish cast, and they have less definition to them as they're back in space, because the atmosphere between the viewer and where they're actually sitting on the mountain. You can tell as I continue to paint these tree lines, the difference in some of the tones that I put down right above where I'm brushing. You can see the bluish cast that those shapes have compared to some of the warmer green tones that I've used. Now I'm going to take my larger wash brush, and I'm going to continue to give an indication of some fir trees here, some mountain firs that are stretched out all along this area through the peaks and through the valleys. And you can tell I'm not trying to paint individual trees. I'm just giving the indication of these tree lines, which in themselves kind of make a large shape. And once this is dry, I'll come back over these and start to paint some of the larger tree shapes that are more in the foreground. But the one thing you can look at is the variety of warm and cool colors that I've used. Even some areas where the values are similar, you can see that there's a variation in the warm and cool colors that are used. I'm going to insert the reference photo in the bottom left-hand corner here, and I'm going to begin to paint some of the shadowed areas that are on this rocky face of the mountain. I'll be using a mixture of cobalt blue with rose madder quinacridone, and I'll also be mixing a little bit of ultramarine blue at times. This combination gives me a blue-violet tone that I'm using to give the suggestion of the shadowed areas on this mountain. I'm using a number 4 round brush for this, just a general purpose brush, and I'm giving just the indication of these shadowed areas. I'm not necessarily trying to render every little line and small shape that I see in the photograph, just trying to give a representation of what I'm seeing by some of the patterns and textures that I'll be putting down. And keep in mind also, there's just a little bit of masking fluid that I splattered before I put these washes down that will give just a little bit of sparkle to it when I remove it. There's not a lot in this area, just enough to create a little bit of texture. One way to paint this would be to take a small brush and spend hours noodling away trying to capture every little crack and crevice that you see in the photograph. And there's nothing wrong with it if that's the approach you want to take. It's just not my approach. So I do a lot of suggestion and representing with patterns and textures and shape more so than trying to copy the photograph. You can see the brushwork I've done on the right. Now I'm going to move over towards the left side here. And I've got a larger brush and I'm painting some larger areas here. And as I paint this, there's areas where I've softened edges with a damp brush with water or hit it with a spray. So again, I'm just painting shapes of value here. And I'm going to use a spritz here of a kind of a coarse spray to add a little texture to that wash I've put down. So that's just a small spray bottle. It's not the fine mist spray that I often use, but it just spritzes some clear water onto it, and then it just creates some texture into the wash itself. I'm going to apply a little bit more of this blue-violet tone, and it's a middle value, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to spray some of that coarse spray, spritz that clear water into this wash, again to create some texture, and you should be able to see it a little bit better in this because this is a little darker mixture that I'm spraying into. I also create texture as I touch the tissue to the various areas. So here I've got the small bottle. It's just a spritz of water, and you can start to see a little texture appear in that shape. And here I'm just using a fine mist spray now and trying to diffuse a little of that color and let it run. So now I'm going to begin to paint some of these fir tree shapes that are in the foreground, and they're very dark value. So going over top of what I've painted already will work just fine because this is such a dark value. And I'll be using a mixture of sap green with some pyro red and some royal blue. And I'll be using those in different variations in terms of the ratio of each of those in the mixture. And at times it'll go a little warmer, at times it'll go a little cooler. But for the most part, those are the colors I'll be using. And from time to time, I'll mix in a little bit of raw sienna, which will warm it up a little bit. I often use sap green as a base green in some of my paintings, and I use it in combination with pyro red and royal blue and sometimes raw sienna. And by adding those other colors to my sap green, I can start to shift that hue towards the warm side or cool side, and I also can start to neutralize that color. And by using royal blue, that can give me a much darker value also, so I can help shift the value. And another color that I'll work in with it sometimes is raw umber. So there's so many greens out there that are available to you, but you can just have a base color, and you can shift it around by adding different paints to it to make it warm, to make it cool, to make it light, make it dark. You can make it more yellow. You can make it bluer, just by adding a few of these other paints. And that's what I tend to do a lot in my paintings. As I said, sap green is one that I tend to use as a base, and then I influence that with other paints that I mix into it. As I paint these tree shapes in the foreground, hopefully you can see the subtle shifts in the color that I'm using. The mixture I'm applying right now is a cooler, darker green, and it has a larger percentage of royal blue into the mixture. And the first tree that I painted had a little bit more sap green and pyro red, and still had some royal blue in it, but a little less than what I'm using right now. So these trees I'm painting at the moment tend to be very dark, cool green tree shapes that I'm painting. Here I'm still working with very dark, fairly cool mixtures as I paint this. I'm using a quill brush that I like to use because it holds quite a bit of paint and it has a fine tip, and it works pretty well, I think, when I'm trying to paint subjects such as these mountain firs. We know that I'm painting individual trees in particular because of these very narrow tops of these mountain fern. But as I come down lower on the tree, they start to run into one another and just become one large shape. You'll start to see hopefully some direction that indicates that there's multiple trees here, but the value holds together as a large shape, and that's how I start to treat it. Less so at the top where I'm describing individual treetops, but the bottom I'm less concerned with individual branches and the characteristics of any given tree, even though I will give the suggestion that there are some branches and variation in the greenery on the tree there, but you can see how this all kind of comes together at the base as a large shape. I'm painting another tree here in the foreground, and all these trees here are in the same proximity here in this foreground. They're all a dark value because they're all basically in the same area in the foreground. As you move back in space, my values get lighter in those trees that are in the middle ground, and even farther back, they're more of a middle value here to help differentiate what's close and what's far away. So these trees that are very close in the foreground are very dark, and then the value starts to get more towards the middle as you go back to towards the middle ground. If the value on these trees in the foreground was all over the place, it would get confusing on what's close and what's far away, what's the foreground, what's the middle ground. If you go back to my original sketch, I represented the placement of these trees just by a line, a vertical line, just to show basically the placement and the height. But I didn't try to draw with a pencil all the little branches and everything on the tree. I'm doing that with my brushwork. So it's just a different approach. You could render this out in fine detail with a pencil and come back, as I said earlier, with a small brush and just paint little brush strokes and try and render the photograph and do a literal copy of the photograph. But that's just not how I'm painting. I like to be expressive with my brush and describe with my brush. So the less that I can put into my drawing, the more freedom I'll have as I evolve my painting. This last very large tree shape that I'm going to paint runs off the page at the top and at the side, and I'm just painting this with a bigger brush. I'm using my big wash brush, and I'm just going to paint this large dark shape, and I'm going to kind of describe the edge a little bit here at first, and then I'm going to come back and basically fill this in with this dark value. And keep in mind that this is one of the areas where I had put some masking fluid, splattered it on there with a toothbrush. So once this is dried and I remove that masking fluid, you'll start to see some of those little bits of sparkle come through as a result of putting some of that masking fluid on at the beginning of my painting process. What I'm trying to represent here is this very large, close, dark value tree that has little splashes of light coming through. It's many layers of needles that are on this fern. I'm going to use some of the same mixtures that I've been using to sharpen up a few of these distant pine trees. So to do this, I'm using a number 4 synthetic sable. This one is made by made by Princeton Brush Company. It's part of their Aqua Elite series, and it maintains a very nice point and holds a sufficient amount of paint on it, so I don't have to keep taking it back to my palette to refill it. But I'm just giving an indication, just a little stronger indication of these trees, and give them a little bit more definition to represent that tree line. It got a little washed away there. And I'll still use this fine mist spray to soften some of those edges. But I'm going to come over to this other side and I'm going to do the same thing here, just give a little bit more definition to the tree lines. I like being able to paint a fairly rigid edge on something such as this, and then come in here with a fine mist spray and just soften a little bit and spray in a direction that I want that paint to flow. So I'm working wet on dry, but then once I introduce that fine mist spray, it becomes very wet, and if I continue to apply paint there with a brush, it'd be working wet and wet. But for the most part, It's still wet on dry, and I just softened some edges with that spray. I'm going to come back in here on these tree shapes that I've already painted, and now I have a mixture that's got royal blue, raw umber, and some sap green in it, but it's a pretty dark mixture. And I'm using this number 4 synthetic sable aqua elite brush here just to give an indication of some of the tree trunk and some thicker areas here on the branches. It's a subtle difference because the values are very close. The mixture I'm putting out right now is probably a bit darker, but it's also cooler. So it's just you can see the subtle variation in the two tones of what I already had applied and what I'm applying now, but it helps give some more definition and form to these tree shapes so they're not as flat. I'm also going to come over to the other side here and put a little bit of this value on this tree here to the right. So I'm going to help define a little bit that the linear shape there that is the tree trunk. And I'm not drawing a line all the way from top to bottom. I'm just giving some indication there in spots of that linear shape that is the tree trunk. And then again, I'm giving an indication of some of the areas where the branches are a little heavier and darker. I'm going to do some similar brush work here on this larger tree shape, but I'm using a larger brush. I switched back to the Jumbo Round small wash brush that I like to use, the round brush. And I'm just giving a suggestion of some of the branches here. And this is a very dark value on a dark value. So they're both very dark, and but it's just a subtle difference to give a suggestion of these branches and give it a little bit more form, a little bit more volume. Now I want to push some areas back, so I'm going to take a light wash, a light medium wash of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to just paint some areas on top of what I've done here to help just make them feel like they're a little bit more distant than what they do right now. So just a little bit of blue, ultramarine blue here. There's a little splatter to give some texture. I'm going to try and protect the sky there so I don't get a lot of that. But just creating a little bit of dark value texture or medium value texture with this blue, just to give the indication that there's a lot of irregularities and rocks and bumps in the surface there. And then you see me using this kind of coarse spray here to create some texture. Now I'm going to take a dark value here. This is a mixture of royal blue and raw umber. And this is an area that I've masked to protect the light area that's going to be this dried tree that's here with some broken branches. And before I take that masking off, I'm taking this dark value and I'm basically highlighting some of the edges here with a dark value so that when I take that masking fluid off, there'll be this dark value next to those light lights. Now I'm going to take the pickup eraser. I'm going to pick up this masking fluid that I put on earlier. And as I do, you'll start to see this tree shape revealed from this dried out tree sitting here. And you'll start to see some of the snowpack on the mountain. And you'll also start to see some of these areas of sparkle in the tree shapes that I had painted that I had mentioned earlier. Some of these areas, I'll touch those light areas of sparkle with a light green, a warm green tone, just to give the feeling that there's some sunlight hitting the edges of the trees. I had saved some of these areas of white to represent the snowpack on the mountain, and they're actually going to have an irregular edge. So now I'm bringing up some treetops to overlap some of those shapes. It makes it more believable because they're not going to be a clean straight edge on the bottom side of those shapes. They're going to have some foliage from the trees and branches hanging over them. And so that's what I'm going to put in here right now using this darker value. And I'm just going to, doesn't take much, just a few touches here and there to break up that straight edge. However, in some areas it does remain a straight edge. In this particular area right here, I need to complete this tree because it comes up and it overlaps that, and I had that area masked off. Now I'm going to take just this light green, yellow-green mixture that's made with pretty much pure sap green, just a touch of raw sienna in it, but it's mostly sap green. And I'm touching some of the edges here where I reveal some of these light colors just to warm it up a little bit and give it a warm green tone that suggests that the sunlight is getting through and hitting some of the branches and some of the needles on this tree. Next, I'm going to take a mixture here with cobalt blue and rose madder quinacridone, and I'm going to take this kind of blue violet tone and put it on this tree shape. I'm also going to take that and carry it down to some of the branches here. And I'm doing it all as one wash. Coming back with this dark mixture of royal blue and raw umber, and putting some of that dark value a little lower on this tree and another area here on the right side. I'm going to just strengthen that value and take it a little bit farther down all the way to the edge here. I feel that it was starting to float a little bit, so taking that dark value and just taking it all the way to the edge. Just a final touch here. There's a few areas where that masking fluid dropped on the page. It just looks like a drop of something landed there. So I'm just taking a darker value and breaking the edge up a little bit and changing the shape so it looks more natural. It doesn't look like something just dropped onto the page. I'm going to put a mat on this to get a good look. And there's my painting, Mountain View. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my online learning center where you can find links to my YouTube channel, information about my workshops, as well as my latest online courses. And as always, if you have any questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rsurowiczart.com. And if you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart at gmail.com. Thanks for watching.